On a December night in Los Angeles, Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead inside their home. Hours later, their adult son was arrested and formally charged. No public warning, no visible struggle. Just a sealed residence, a police perimeter, and a family story that ended without appeal. What immediately separated this case from countless others was simple and unsettling. There was no intruder, no robbery, no outside suspect identified at the scene. The investigation pointed inward, not outward. When a tragedy has a suspect but no clear explanation, where does the truth actually stop? This channel follows stories where the public record is incomplete by design. What comes next is not a theory, but a reconstruction of what is known and what remains deliberately unspoken. To the public, Rob Reiner represented continuity and reliability. For decades, his name signaled a certain moral steadiness, work shaped by character-driven storytelling, professional discipline, and long-standing relationships inside Hollywood. He was widely perceived as someone who valued order over chaos, structure over impulse. That perception matters because it frames why the events that followed resisted easy explanation. Away from the screen, the Reiner household was largely absent from tabloid culture. Unlike many high-profile families, there were few public disputes, no ongoing court battles, and no steady drip of personal disclosures. The family's private life remained mostly private by design. When information did surface, it tended to be limited to professional milestones, charitable involvement, or carefully managed public appearances. This relative silence created a strong contrast between the image audiences recognized and the opacity that surrounded the family's internal dynamics. That contrast is critical. In cases involving public figures, audiences often search backward for obvious warning signs, statements, scandals, or patterns that might retroactively explain a collapse. Here, the record offered little of that. What existed instead were fragments, professional commitments, intermittent family collaborations, and occasional interviews that revealed warmth without revealing tension. None of it formed a clear narrative of impending disaster. The absence of a visible buildup became part of the story itself. The case drew immediate attention not simply because of who was involved, but because it resisted the familiar frames typically applied to celebrity tragedy. There was no external antagonist that could be easily named, no public feud that could be traced forward, no singular incident that clearly marked a turning point in the public record. The story unfolded inside a space that had rarely been open to outside scrutiny, leaving investigators, journalists, and the public working from partial information. As authorities began their work, the gap between public identity and private reality widened. Statements were measured. Details were limited. Certain records were not released. This restraint, while procedurally routine, intensified public uncertainty. In the absence of definitive explanations, speculation flourished, often unchecked, often inaccurate. Yet the official record remained narrow, emphasizing process over narrative and caution over interpretation. This is why the story cannot be understood solely as a crime report or a celebrity headline. It sits at the intersection of reputation, privacy, and institutional silence. The central figures were known, but the context that mattered most was not. What follows, therefore, is not an attempt to fill those gaps with assumption, but to trace the sequence of what can be verified, while acknowledging the limits of what is publicly known. Long before the investigation began, the Reiner family operated within a structure that appeared conventional by Hollywood standards. Professional success, financial stability, and long-term public recognition formed the outer framework. Inside that framework, daily life followed routines that, from the outside, suggested predictability rather than volatility. This matters because the narrative that emerged after the tragedy often attempted to compress years into a single moment. The available record does not support that simplification. Family relationships developed over decades, shaped by generational expectations and the pressures that accompany visibility. Work and identity were closely intertwined. Professional collaboration occasionally overlapped with family life, blurring lines that, in other households, might remain distinct. This overlap did not automatically signal dysfunction, but it did create a setting where personal disagreements could not be easily separated from professional judgment. In such environments, conflict does not always announce itself. It accumulates quietly. Accounts from acquaintances describe a household that valued discipline and self-control. Emotional displays were not a defining feature of the family's public interactions. Disputes, when they occurred, were rarely aired in social settings. This restraint contributed to the perception of stability. but it also meant that internal strain, if present, would have been difficult for outsiders to detect. Stability, in this context, was as much about containment as it was about harmony. The adult years of the children introduced a different dynamic. Independence brought distance, and distance altered communication patterns. Expectations that once flowed in one direction became more complex. Parents accustomed to authority had to renegotiate boundaries. Children navigating adulthood faced the challenge of defining themselves without severing ties. These transitions are common, but they carry particular weight in families where public identity is fixed and widely recognized. There is evidence, reported cautiously by credible outlets, that disagreements occurred during this period. The nature of those disagreements has not been fully disclosed, and their frequency remains unclear. What can be said with confidence is that they did not manifest as public disputes or legal actions. They remained contained within private spaces, discussed selectively, and often reframed as temporary rather than structural. This framing would later complicate efforts to reconstruct intent and escalation. Mental and emotional health, where referenced, appears in the public record only in general terms. No comprehensive diagnoses have been released. No definitive timelines have been established. What exists are indirect references, mentions of concern, of attempts to address issues, of conversations that did not produce resolution. These references are important, not because they explain outcomes, but because they illustrate how uncertainty existed well before the final event, even if it was not publicly acknowledged. The family's ability to maintain outward normalcy relied heavily on compartmentalization. Professional obligations continued. Social appearances were managed. Communication with the press remained minimal. In effect, the household functioned as a closed system, responsive to external demands while insulating internal dynamics. Such systems can remain intact for long periods, particularly when resources allow problems to be addressed privately rather than publicly. By the time tensions reportedly intensified, there was still no indication that the situation had reached a critical threshold. No emergency interventions were recorded. No protective orders were sought. No public statements suggested fear of imminent harm. The absence of these markers would later become a focal point for both public confusion and investigative caution. Without them, causality could not be easily inferred. This chapter of the story is defined less by action than by accumulation. Patterns formed gradually, shaped by routine decisions and unresolved disagreements. The absence of visible rupture does not imply the absence of strain. It indicates that whatever strain existed had not yet breached the boundaries of privacy. Understanding this foundation is essential because it underscores a central tension of the case. The most consequential dynamics unfolded in spaces that were not documented in real time. The period leading up to the tragedy is marked by a shift that is subtle in the public record, but consequential in retrospect. What had long been contained within private boundaries began to surface in limited, indirect ways. Not through public confrontation or legal filings, but through changes in behavior reported after the fact by those who had proximity to the family. These accounts do not describe a single breaking point. They describe movement, gradual, uneven, and difficult to interpret in real time. Communication patterns appear to have changed first. Conversations that once de-escalated tension no longer produced resolution. Disagreements lingered longer. Attempts to restore normalcy became less effective. This stage is important because it represents a common inflection point in family conflict, the moment when familiar tools stop working, but no alternative structure has replaced them. In such moments, uncertainty increases and interpretation begins to diverge. Some reports reference expressions of concern raised within the family. These references are careful and unspecific, reflecting both legal sensitivity and the limits of what has been confirmed. They do not establish intent or predict outcome. They indicate awareness, an acknowledgement that something was not aligning as it once had. The distinction matters. Awareness does not equate to inevitability, and concern does not equate to expectation. The escalation phase is also where external interpretation often distorts internal reality. Observers, looking backward, search for statements or actions that can be labeled as warnings. Yet many of the details cited after the tragedy were not treated as urgent at the time they occurred. They were absorbed into the background of everyday life, contextualized as temporary or manageable. This is not unusual. Most families interpret tension through the lens of continuity, assuming that what has always stabilized the situation will continue to do so. What complicates this phase is the lack of contemporaneous documentation. There are no recordings, no written timelines released to the public, no detailed accounts created before the event. The story is reconstructed from memory, filtered through shock and legal constraint. As a result, certainty becomes fragmented. What one person recalls as a warning, another recalls as frustration. What one describes as escalation, another remembers as a return to normalcy shortly afterward. Professional obligations continued during this period, reinforcing the appearance of stability. Schedules were maintained. Commitments were honored. Public presence did not change dramatically. This continuity had a dual effect. It reassured those outside the family, while also delaying external intervention. When life appears to be moving forward, concern rarely triggers decisive action. Momentum becomes its own form of insulation. There are also indications that attempts were made to address underlying issues through conversation rather than confrontation. This approach aligns with the family's long-standing preference for containment. Problems were discussed, not broadcast. Solutions were sought privately, not imposed publicly. Such strategies can be effective in many cases, but they depend on a shared understanding of risk. When that understanding diverges, dialogue alone may no longer be sufficient. The escalation phase does not present a clear antagonist or a defined sequence of provocations. It presents ambiguity. Tension existed, but its trajectory was not linear. Periods of calm interrupted periods of strain. Reassurance followed alarm. In hindsight, this oscillation appears unstable. At the time, it likely appeared familiar. Families often mistake familiarity for safety. This ambiguity is why investigators approach this phase with restraint. Without explicit evidence of imminent danger, interpretation remains provisional. The public record reflects this caution. Statements emphasize what is known while deliberately avoiding inference about motive or state of mind. The result is a narrative that feels incomplete because it is. Certain aspects are withheld not to obscure truth, but to prevent misrepresentation. What can be established is that by the end of this phase, the equilibrium that had defined the household was no longer intact. Containment had weakened. Communication had become less effective. The systems that once absorbed tension were under strain. Yet even at this point, there was no clear signal that the situation had crossed into irreversibility. That threshold would be crossed later, under circumstances that transformed uncertainty into finality. The next chapter examines that transition, focusing only on what can be verified and on the questions that remain unanswered by design. The final phase begins with a narrowing of time. What had unfolded over years compressed into hours, then minutes, then a single sequence that could not be undone. Law enforcement accounts describe a response triggered by circumstances that required immediate action, followed by procedures that moved quickly but deliberately. From this point forward, the narrative shifts from family history to evidentiary process. Authorities have confirmed that the deaths were discovered inside the residence and that the scene was secured without delay. Details beyond that threshold were limited in early briefings, a decision consistent with active investigations involving close relatives. The absence of early specificity was not accidental. In cases where potential criminal liability intersects with family relationships, disclosure is often paced to preserve due process and prevent contamination of testimony. The result is a public timeline that feels abrupt because it is intentionally constrained. What followed was an arrest and the announcement of formal charges. These steps established a legal frame without resolving the underlying questions that had already taken hold in public discourse. An arrest answers the question of who is accused. It does not answer why events unfolded as they did. Prosecutors, bound by evidentiary standards, emphasized allegations rather than narrative. Their language was precise, procedural, and notably restrained. From that moment, the case entered a different jurisdiction, not only the courts, but the collective imagination. The same facts were read in divergent ways. Some interpreted speed as certainty. Others saw caution as omission. Both readings overlooked a fundamental reality of criminal proceedings. Clarity is rarely immediate, and silence often reflects obligation rather than concealment. Certain records were sealed. Certain statements were deferred. These decisions created a vacuum. In that vacuum, speculation flourished, often detached from verified information. Yet the official record remained narrow. Timelines were acknowledged without granular detail. Motive was not addressed. Prior conflicts, if any, were not characterized. This restraint signaled that the most sensitive elements of the case were not yet part of the public domain. The emotional impact of this phase cannot be overstated, but it must be described carefully. For those directly involved, the transition from private crisis to public proceeding was instantaneous. Grief and shock unfolded under scrutiny. For the public, the shift was disorienting. A familiar figure was suddenly reframed by an accusation that contradicted decades of perceived stability. The dissonance between image and allegation intensified attention, even as information remained scarce. Investigators approached the scene and subsequent evidence with a singular priority: establishing a factual chain that could withstand legal challenge. This priority often conflicts with public expectation. Audiences seek narrative coherence. Investigations seek corroboration. Where the two diverge, frustration emerges. In this case, divergence was immediate and sustained. What is known at this stage is limited but significant. Charges were filed. Custody was established. Legal counsel became involved. Court dates were set. What is not known carries equal weight. The precise sequence of events inside the residence has not been publicly reconstructed. The content of final conversations, if any, has not been disclosed. The presence or absence of specific triggers remains unaddressed in official statements. This asymmetry between what is confirmed and what is withheld defines the point of no return. The case moved beyond the realm of private resolution and entered a process that unfolds according to institutional timelines rather than personal ones. From this moment forward, outcomes would be determined not by reconciliation or explanation, but by legal standards and evidentiary thresholds. The significance of this phase lies not only in what happened, but in what ceased to be possible. Once charges were filed, interpretation narrowed. Silence took on legal meaning. Statements became liabilities. The family's ability to shape its own narrative ended, replaced by a framework that prioritizes procedure over context. The story does not resolve here. It changes form. The next chapter examines what followed immediately after: the public response, the professional reverberations, and the ways in which institutions and communities responded to a tragedy that resisted simple classification. Once the legal process moved into view, the effects radiated outward with speed. The focus of attention shifted from the private space of the residence to a public arena governed by procedure, precedent, and scrutiny. Statements from authorities remained narrow, emphasizing charges and next steps rather than interpretation. This restraint, while standard, left much of the emotional and contextual ground unaddressed. Into that gap flowed reaction. Public response formed along predictable lines. Initial shock gave way to polarized certainty, even in the absence of new information. Some assumed that the presence of charges implied clarity. Others emphasized the presumption of innocence and warned against narrative shortcuts. Both positions drew confidence from partial facts. Neither could resolve the central uncertainty: how a family long perceived as stable arrived at a criminal proceeding involving its own members. Within Hollywood, the response was cautious and fragmented. Tributes acknowledged a career and a legacy without engaging the circumstances of the deaths. Professional organizations and colleagues opted for language that honored work while avoiding commentary on the case itself. This separation was deliberate. In an industry acutely aware of legal exposure, silence often functions as both respect and self-protection. The result was a public mourning that felt incomplete, marked by what was said and by what was carefully omitted. Media coverage followed a similar pattern. Headlines emphasized confirmed developments, arrest, charges, court scheduling, while editorials speculated about broader implications. The distinction between reporting and interpretation blurred quickly. Yet the most consequential decisions were made away from cameras. Legal teams began assembling. Family representatives limited contact. Requests for privacy were issued, then largely ignored. The speed of circulation outpaced the speed of verification. For those closest to the case, the transition was abrupt. Private grief became public subject matter. Routine actions acquired symbolic weight. Silence was interpreted as strategy. Every appearance or absence was read for meaning. In this environment, restraint can be mistaken for evasion and caution for concealment. The pressure to respond collided with the obligation not to prejudice proceedings. Institutional processes advanced methodically. Court filings established procedural landmarks without revealing substantive detail. Hearings addressed custody and scheduling rather than evidence. The case began to assume a rhythm dictated by calendars and statutes, not by emotional resolution. This rhythm often frustrates observers, but it serves a specific purpose: to separate outcome from outrage. The broader cultural response revealed a recurring tension in high-profile cases. Audiences seek coherence. They want to understand not only what happened, but how it could happen. When answers are delayed, substitute explanations emerge. Past statements are reinterpreted. Ordinary behaviors are recast as signals. The narrative expands even as the evidentiary record remains fixed. This expansion carries consequences. Reputations are reassessed. Relationships are re-examined. The past is reorganized around the present event. In such moments, restraint becomes difficult to maintain, particularly when the individuals involved are widely known. Yet restraint is precisely what the legal process demands. The difference between allegation and proof is not rhetorical, it is foundational. The immediate fallout thus unfolded on two tracks. One was procedural, advancing through filings and hearings with deliberate pace. The other was cultural, accelerating through commentary and conjecture. These tracks rarely align. Their divergence created a sense of dissonance that persisted, reinforcing the perception that something essential remained out of reach. As time passed, attention did not resolve the uncertainty. It intensified it. Each new procedural step confirmed the seriousness of the case without illuminating its core. The tragedy became defined less by new information than by the absence of it. Silence, once a protective boundary, became a source of pressure. The next phase addresses that silence directly, not to fill it with conjecture, but to examine its function, what is withheld, why it is withheld, and what that withholding means for understanding a story that may never offer the closure many expect. As the case settled into legal process, a different narrative began to take shape, not through new disclosures, but through absence. Certain records remained sealed. Certain details were not expanded upon. Timelines were acknowledged without elaboration. This silence was not accidental, nor was it unusual. It reflected the boundaries imposed by law, by procedure, and by the recognition that some information, once released, cannot be retrieved. In high-profile cases, silence often invites interpretation. Viewers assume that what is withheld must be revelatory. In reality, withholding more often serves a narrower purpose, protecting the integrity of proceedings and the rights of those involved. This distinction rarely satisfies public curiosity. It does, however, define the limits of what can be responsibly known. In this case, those limits were reached quickly and held firmly. The unanswered layer includes questions that may never be publicly resolved. The precise sequence of events inside the residence has not been reconstructed in detail. The content of final interactions, if any occurred, has not been disclosed. The internal reasoning behind actions alleged by prosecutors has not been articulated beyond formal charges. These gaps are not oversights. They are structural features of a process that prioritizes proof over narrative. For the family, this silence carries a different weight. Private grief unfolds without the relief of explanation. Public perception forms without access to context. Every withheld detail becomes a space where speculation can take root, even as those closest to the truth are constrained from responding. The cost of this asymmetry is borne unevenly, but it is real. From a broader perspective, the unanswered layer exposes a recurring tension between public interest and personal boundary. The individuals involved are known, but the most consequential aspects of the story remain inaccessible. This tension challenges the assumption that visibility guarantees understanding. Fame provides exposure, not clarity. In moments of crisis, it may even obscure it. What remains then is not a solution but a condition. The case exists in a suspended state, defined by process rather than revelation. Outcomes will eventually be reached in court, but those outcomes may address only narrow questions of responsibility. They may not resolve the deeper uncertainties that continue to draw attention. This unresolved quality is not a failure of reporting or investigation. It is a reflection of reality. Not every tragedy yields a narrative that satisfies curiosity or restores balance. Some stories conclude with verdicts, but without closure. Others never fully conclude at all. Understanding this does not diminish the gravity of what occurred. It reframes it. The absence of answers becomes part of the story, not as an invitation to speculate, but as a reminder of the limits of public knowledge. In this case, those limits are not incidental. They are central. What remains after the headlines fade is not clarity, but consequence. A family lost its center. A public figure was reduced to a name in a case file, and a story that many expected to resolve into motive or meaning instead settled into procedure and silence. The legal process will continue, measured and constrained, addressing specific questions of responsibility. It may deliver a verdict. It may establish facts. It will not reconstruct everything that was lost. This is the quiet reality behind many tragedies that unfold in public view. The presence of charges does not guarantee understanding. The existence of records does not ensure access. And time, which is often expected to explain, sometimes only confirms what cannot be known. In this case, the distance between public identity and private reality never fully closed. It widened, leaving behind a narrative shaped as much by what was withheld as by what was confirmed. The temptation in moments like this is to force coherence where none exists, to assign motive prematurely, to turn absence into implication. But restraint matters, not because it protects institutions, but because it respects the boundary between verified fact and irreversible assumption. Once crossed, that boundary cannot be restored. This story does not end with resolution. It ends with recognition that some events resist narrative completion and that understanding has limits even in an age of constant exposure. The unanswered elements are not gaps to be filled, but conditions to be acknowledged. If this kind of careful, evidence-bound storytelling matters to you, you can support the work by following the channel. Not for answers that cannot yet be given, but for stories examined with discipline, context, and respect for what remains unspoken. The case will move forward. The questions may not.